Welcome to this video podcast. In collaboration with the Royal Swedish Academy of War Sciences and its project ceasefire, we explore Sweden's path into NATO and the EU, as well as issues of deterrence and resilience. How are these affected by NATO membership, developments in the USA, and the war that Russia initiated against Ukraine in 2014, which escalated into a full-scale invasion in 2022? In recent years, questions about nuclear deterrence have increased, especially after Donald Trump's second presidential term in the USA. What can we really expect from US support in an existential crisis? Is it enough for Europe to double its defense spending, or will the demands for European efforts increase before the USA provides the necessary backstop on conventional and nuclear levels? Against this background, a discussion about military defense, primarily linked to Sweden, has blossomed in Europe. With us today is Karlis Neretnieks, a former Major General and a long-standing member of the Academy, known for his eminent knowledge about Nordic-Baltic defense. The conversation begins with references to Karlis' report on the military situation published in the midterm report of the project and finalized at the beginning of this year. The article presents theses that are then tested through scenario descriptions with critical questions from a devil's advocate perspective. Karlis will then provide a synthesis that we hope can give opinion leaders and decision-makers in Sweden a basis for taking a stand on the issue. In the final part of our podcast, Sahlin, a member of the Academy and with a broad security policy background as State Secretary in the Ministry of Defense and Ambassador in several key positions in Europe, will participate. He will place the issue in a larger security policy context and pose further questions about how Russia and the USA might react.
Again, welcome to you both. We are representing one project or group of projects within the Royal Swedish Academy of War Sciences, which is called ceasefire, which means responding to the problems relating to deterrence and resilience as Sweden becomes a member of NATO and also has been a member of the EU for quite some time. And we did an interim first report last year, but we continued with a midterm report of the project, which we actually finished more or less the text. We finished late autumn, around Christmas maybe, and we managed to get it published a month ago or so. And that was sort of an assessment of two time perspectives. One is the situation after the elections in the United States, the possible window of opportunity of Donald Trump to change things after starting up his second presidency, and the other time perspective, which not least you, Karlis, have outlined very clearly in your chapter of the midterm report. See what will happen after a possible frozen conflict in Ukraine when the Russian government is able to reconstitute forces towards the north. What kind of situation does that put us in? So here is an updated version of your report written in English using some AI sources. Collecting sources on the basis of the text that you have written. And it starts basically by introducing your report, focusing on scenarios with reduced American security engagement in Europe, and looking towards a couple of scenarios that might follow from the current state of play. So what you initially talked about was the time gap, so to say, between a potential American disengagement and the possibilities for us in Europe to reconstitute our defense capacity after a disastrous period after the end of the Cold War, basically. And your concern in the report has been truly validated, one must say, by the fact that there has been a strong reaction in Europe. The question is, and the rearm Europe plan, and let's say to the viewers of this podcast, say that if you find the things go too fast and there is text here that you cannot digest, you just stop the podcast, read the text, and then continue. So we will not go into every word of this in detail in the podcast itself, but rather prioritize listening to Karlis and then to Michael, how you see things on the basis of this text. So you've seen the rearm plan, but we are still talking about plans to a very large extent. How do you, and that might be the first question to you. How do you see the European response? Does it exceed your expectations, or is it what you hope for, or you hope for more?
Hoping is not much to base plans on, but the real problem at the moment is there are two problems really when it comes to time. One is if the US disengage from Europe, and if it does that during this administration, that means within 4 years, then we are, let's call it, in big trouble. Because the plans that most European countries have when it comes to rearmament are 5-year or even 10-year plans. So if the US withdraws from Europe within 2 or 3 years, then we will have a Europe that is not prepared at all to handle some kind of new military conflict in Europe. For example, if Russia would choose to attack one or all the Baltic states, we won't have the capacity within a European NATO framework or within the EU framework. So the hope that we might have is that we can make some kind of deal with the US to have a gradual retreat from Europe, or moving to Asia, as the US will have to do. But it has to be done gradually. That's one of the problems we have. The second problem when it comes to a time gap is how fast can Russia reconstitute or reorganize its forces after a possible ceasefire or a truce in Ukraine? And there are several ideas, but the Danish intelligence services, they have predicted that it would be possible for the Russians to do something within 2 years, but then, let's call it, with just reorganized forces, not modernized forces. If the Russians would like to modernize their forces before a new conflict, then it might take 5 years. And the really unfortunate thing in this is that most European countries somehow have accepted the longer time frame, the 5 years or 10 years perspective. There is a lack of urgency in Europe when it comes to rearmament, because if this 2-year time frame would be used by the Russians, combined with the US withdrawal from Europe, then we will have extremely big problems handling the situation.
So what you're saying basically is that there is a curve. We are now not under immediate full-scale threat. We are under attack, hybrid and so forth. But the situation could actually become worse before it becomes better again later.
It could become very much worse. If we have, we could put it another way, as long as the war in Ukraine continues, then we have some kind of breathing space. The Ukrainians are engaging the Russians. As soon as the war ends in Ukraine, then the threat will increase. And if you combine that with an American withdrawal or retreat, then we will have a really serious situation.
Yeah. So let's go into that more deeply later. Just go through sort of a first overview of the report as it looked. We have the question of the integration with NATO. Do you think that is proceeding the way it should, so to say?
From a Swedish point of view, yes. The process is running quite well, I would say. Swedish officers, Swedish units are integrating well in NATO. So, no, I see no problems really in that area. It's more a question of Sweden and NATO. We are not prepared enough for a big war. But the integration, let's call it the practical things, it's working quite well.
Okay. But how far are we? I mean, with the actual implementation, for instance, the Finnish presence by Swedish forces is not yet there, is it? We have our presence in Latvia, but we do not yet have it in Finland, do we?
No, but that's not really important to my mind.
Okay.
The units that we have that will probably move into Finland in case of a conflict, they are up in the north. And no, that's more a question of deploying into Finland. The units exist mainly, they are well trained, the plans are coordinated with the Finns. So, no, that's a practical thing. That will be a question of building infrastructure. But from a war fighting point of view, it's not that extremely important.
And then we have the another big building block is the question about the European security architecture. We have the REARM program, we have the white paper on defense, which has been put forward. We have the Niinistö earlier report and so forth. Is that more than paper so far, so to say? I mean, or is it again another EU plan which takes many years to implement?
The Swedish white paper or the Swedish defense decision, the next 5-year plan, it's being implemented. Perhaps not as fast as I would wish, but it's being implemented. Quite a lot of things are happening in the armed forces and also in the civil defense area. So I would say it's on its way without too many problems. Although it could move much faster, but that's another question. Then we are discussing environmental things like, are we allowed to shoot and use training areas in the way we would want to and such things. But it's moving on. When it comes to Europe, and the defense fund, to take one example, that does not move as fast as it should, to my mind. The politicians obviously have agreed that there will be much more money spent on defense, but we haven't seen that very much action yet in the form of orders to the defense industry, big exercises, and also there is a lack of, let's call it, decisions needed to increase the number of soldiers in different countries. We have problems, really big problems in most European countries with recruiting personnel. And that's mainly countries that have not returned to conscription yet. Sweden has returned to conscription. Norway never abolished it, neither did Denmark, neither did Finland. The Baltic states have reintroduced conscription. Poland and Germany are considering to reintroduce conscription, but it will take quite a lot of time before these measures are become units, war-fighting units.
Yeah. And then we have, of course, the nuclear. We should say that we have published a podcast with our colleague Lars-Erik the other day, where we discussed the possibility of some sort of arrangement with France on Europeanizing the deterrent there. So let's not go too much into that, but I think Lars-Erik's conclusion from that one was it is possible, but the question is in what time frame, of course. Okay, so then we have the threat assessment. You mentioned partly already the situation, and the update, the German sources indicate that Russia's military expenditure calculating purchasing power parity has exceeded Europe's combined defense expenditure in the process. So it is a bad situation for us. We are in this gap, a potential gap situation now. Do you want to say anything more about the threat assessment beyond what you already have said?
If I would return to this discussion on time frames that we had, will Russia be dangerous already within 2 years after a truce in Ukraine, or will it take 5 years or more? Then there's another factor that we have to weigh in, and that is how fast can Russia modernize compared with us? We are moving quite slowly, although we have plans, and within 5 or 10 years we will be much better than we are today. But then somehow we are mirror imaging our own, let's call it, lack of capacity on Russia. And then we say, oh, it will take some 5 or perhaps even 10 years for the Russians also. But that's not really true, because Russia has reconstituted or changed its civilian or peacetime industrial processes to wartime production. They have already geared up to wartime production. And that means that Russia is able to modernize and reorganize its forces much faster than we are. And that might be or should be a third factor to weigh in when we are discussing time frames or what time might it take before Russia is prepared for war compared with us. So that's a third factor in this time discussion.
Yeah, just to chip in an aspect which you are touching upon, Karlis, but just to expand on it a little bit more before I have the chance to get back to the broader issues of the time frame and the time gap, which is the Russian economy compared to the EU. As we all know, the EU countries are together overwhelmingly richer in resources than Russia is. But as you say, they have been able to transform itself, the Russians, into a war economy. I have the feeling that the question of the resilience of the total Russian resources will be a major issue during this year, because there are so many other signs that it shouldn't be possible for Russia to continue on this basis, even if they have transformed into a war economy, as you say, and that provides for quicker means to expand and to modernize, etc. But whether the overall resource basis, that depends, I think, also on Russia's links to China and the degree of support there, and its possibilities to export its oil and gas to other global south countries. There are a huge number of issues here, which I think we'll see it dramatized during this year. That would be my addition to what you said at this point.
Okay, so let's go to the issue of Ukraine. What does it mean? We talk about Ukraine. You already mentioned the critical importance of the fact that Ukraine is fighting for us, so to say. And as long as they do that, that means an enormous. Zelensky talks about them having around 100 brigades. I don't know whether this is how you measure that, but any case, it's a huge defense effort that they are making on behalf of Europe. So there we don't know. I mean, Rubio talks about whether Russia actually wants to negotiate a ceasefire or not, whether it's a tactical game or not. That's far outside perhaps the scope of this podcast. Maybe Mikael wants to come back to it, but it aligns with the concern of your report that an advantageous settlement in Ukraine for Russia would put us in a more dangerous position very soon. So we have a number of scenarios one could discuss here in this first part of the podcast. How do you see this notion of a European integrated defense going beyond the NATO framework, so to say? How realistic is such an ambition on the part of Sweden and Europe that actually we would be able to organize ourselves on a European basis? That's the first scenario here.
To begin with, if I return to your description or Russia's role and what Russia is thinking, I think, or I'm quite convinced personally, that Russia is doing its best to rebuild the Tsarist or Soviet Empire as far as possible. So Ukraine is just the start, and even if we had a truce there or some kind of ceasefire, that is just, let's call it a pause in Russian eyes before they continue. So then the question of European defense. There we have, in reality, we have two competing organizations. That is NATO, or the European leg of NATO, or the EU. And to my mind, the best solution should be to utilize, let's call it the NATO structure in Europe, to build some kind of common defense, perhaps with the US in the background somewhere. Because there we already have the procedures, we have a command structure, we are used to work in that framework, trying to create some kind of similar European structure. It would take not years, it would take decades, I think. So if we consider some kind of European solution, then I think we should continue to build on the NATO structure that we already have. But that, of course, does not solve all problems. You already mentioned the nuclear question. The British and the French nuclear capabilities have to be integrated in this framework in one way or another. Otherwise, it's necessary. Otherwise, we will not have the deterrence capabilities that nuclear weapons give and that we must have.
Oh.
So, but to conclude, continue to build on the NATO structure. Don't try to make the EU to a military alliance. It will be too complicated, too time consuming, and we don't have the time.
Yeah. Well, maybe just one illustration, hopeful illustration, is the appearance of General Cavioli, Sakur, in front of the Congress the other day, which gave a more concrete picture of what NATO NATO is actually working, so to say. It is working on the military level, and he gave quite a number of very substantial indications, even in open session. He promised to give much more to the American representatives in closed session, but it made at least me more optimistic about how things are working. Let's hope that he will be replaced by someone who has a similar freedom of action that he seems to have. But of course, there is this debate of whether we are talking about the burden sharing, where, according to this second scenario on the screen now, where the American would keep their core security commitments, even if they pivot towards Asia. They still keep their core commitments, including the nuclear deterrence commitment, so that it doesn't become a shift in terms of that, yes, Europe does more, but the commitments from the American side are weakening, so to say, too much. I don't know how you see this. Is this what is your baseline hope, that this will be the situation? Okay, we accept that they pivot, that they need to do more in Asia, but they still hopefully will see the importance of maintaining their presence in Europe.
Let's put it this way. This scenario could could be described as my favorite scenario, because we Europeans have to understand that the US has global interests outside today's NATO. It's the Pacific, to take one example, but also wherever, the Arctic. And these interests are also, to some extent, our interests. We are also dependent on, let's call it, open lines of communication, shipping in Asia, in the Persian Gulf, perhaps the Northwest Passage in the future. So there has, to my mind, to be some kind of burden sharing between the US and European NATO, let's call it that. And not only the US and European NATO, I think we also, when we are talking about this type of scenario, that we should include Japan, Australia, New Zealand, let's call it what we call, or traditionally call, our friends within the democratic partners globally. So, regardless of this administration in the US, there will be other administrations in the future. I think Europe should pursue some kind of let's help each other scenario. You help us as far as you can, and there the nuclear deterrence, of course, is the most important thing from our point of view, the US nuclear deterrence. And we will help you as far as we can in other areas, in the Pacific, in the Persian Gulf, or wherever. That somehow, to me, looks like the future way to organize our cooperation with the US and other partners.
Good. So let's scroll down to the third scenario, which is something which we know that there are many people who are attached to the notion that why don't we again look at sort of focusing on the Nordic-Baltic area, possibly together with Poland, possibly together with Germany. Can we get beef enough, so to say, really to build up the NB Nordic-Baltic 8 to something militarily, or are we just fooling ourselves that we so to say could live without the support? You are yourself on record for having worried about the possibility of keeping the Suwalki gap open, for instance, Polish. But you are also on record having hoped for a strong German naval presence in the Baltic Sea. Maybe you want to say something about the issue of regionalization.
Let's call it some kind of two-stage plan or a two-stage strategy for the Nordic-Baltic area. The first stage, or the basic structure, is increased Nordic-Baltic cooperation when it comes to defense of the region, where the Nordics and the Baltic states, with, let's call it, some components, also some Polish and German components, are part of it. Because we are here, and we will have to take, let's call it, the first hit if the Russians do something in the Baltic states. We cannot, and that creates some kind of basic both deterrence and defense capability. And we have to create that within the region. But then the next step is, of course, we need support or help from others to have the endurance needed to put up, let's call it a prolonged fight. But this, we cannot organize, let's call it the basic or initial defense in the region based on that support already has arrived or support will arrive in time. No, we have to organize it that we can handle the initial situation ourselves, some days, a week or 2 weeks or whatever it might be, and then hopefully French, British, Dutch support will arrive, or even American support if they're lucky.
Yeah.
So there is a regional dimension, but that is just the first stage in a strategy to defend the Nordic-Baltic area.
Yeah. So then comes the AI grading of your report. So if you ask AI, that is in reality not anybody intelligent person or machine sitting on the other side somewhere virtually, but actually a collection of sources. If you look for the sources that you find on the internet, and check them against your report comes out quite well, actually. It seems that you have certainly not overstated the problem, but you have identified a problem which is real, which has proven itself to be real and has to be proven to be a more urgent problem, perhaps even than we have discussed in our interim report. The fact that the report has attracted some attention now also in the media is not just because, hopefully not just because we alert for the possibility that we actually could be involved in wartime situation in a couple of years, but there is more beef in the report, particularly on the military side, that substantiates this. So maybe you want to say, before we go over to the wider picture, and we want to check with your additional questions as well, but maybe if you just want to say something about the conclusion here. It's basically saying that we have a perhaps somewhat even more difficult situation than we had expected, of course, on the American side in particular.
When I wrote this report, approximately 2 months ago, since then, to my mind, the situation has worsened quite a lot, really. Mainly because the signals we get from the new American administration, both regarding NATO and also regarding Ukraine, that makes this, let's call it my conclusions, perhaps a bit too optimistic. That's one thing. Secondly, it is what you mentioned about Russia having geared up its industrial production to, let's call it, some kind of wartime status. I'm afraid that Russia has, let's call it, stolen a march on us when it comes to rearmament. Although they have used up most of their weapons that they had stored, but if they get some kind of pause, some kind of breathing space with the troops in Ukraine, or some kind of ceasefire, then they might arm faster than we, and that makes me very worried.
Yeah. So if we finally just spend a couple of minutes, see if we have missed something. You had, these are the questions that you put to us in email, which I have translated, not perfectly, but still. What abilities can disappear that we would have to acquire for ourselves? Are we talking then about the strategic enabler? So what is it?
Yes, mainly. Apart from, let's call it, the quantity that we don't have in Europe, let's call it of conventional units like mechanized brigades or fighter squadrons or whatever, there are some capabilities that only the US has, more or less. And that could be, as some examples, that is air refueling. The US dominates that, let's call it, market totally. The same with air transport, also space assets. That would be three areas where we would have to invest heavily to get these capabilities, and unfortunately it would take quite a lot of time also to create these capabilities in a large enough number. So, but as you said, they are enablers, strategic or yes, enablers.
Okay.
Then there is another area where I would also like to mention that the command system, the technical aspects of the command system, it's mainly based on US technology within NATO. And we would have to substitute it with European technology if the US would leave Europe more or less totally. To take a civilian parallel to just to illustrate it, Ukraine uses Starlink to a very large extent at the moment for tactical communication and operational communications. There is, and we, depending on how much we trust US and their businesses, if we would like to substitute it with a European similar system, Eutelsat, it's a European system, not as widespread, but it exists. That would also take some 5 years or something like that and cost an awful lot of money.
Yeah.
And we should not forget that the sea lanes to Europe across the Atlantic are mainly protected by the US Second Fleet. We don't have the capacity in Europe to do that. So that would be another area where we had to invest quite heavily.
The other question you have here is how dependent are the Americans on us? And here I suppose that Michael would include as a staging area, control area for intervention also outside Europe. I'm thinking of Iraq and so forth. The main military engagements in the Middle East have, I suppose, to a large extent been dependent on having hubs in Europe that they can use. And then in addition, you haven't mentioned it, but I would like to mention the question of actually controlling what the Europeans are doing, so to say, that we don't start things that they would be worried, including on. We already know that there is a history of the Suez Canal already in '56 when they were quite worried about what the Brits and the French were doing and so forth. So there is this interdependence, which is probably downplayed in the debate right now, but which might come back. What do you think about this?
I totally agree with you. I would say there are three areas where the US would like or even needs to have, let's call it, European support. And I start with those two that you mentioned. The US, of course, would like to have a good insight in what the Europeans are doing and why they are doing it, and perhaps also try to influence it. The US, it's a natural, really, wish by a great power, seeing or having insight in what others do. That's one area. Secondly, exactly as you said, Ramstein, to take that example in Germany, is a hub for American operations in the Middle East and in Africa. So if that would disappear, that would create quite large problems for the US, acting also outside Europe. Thirdly, and perhaps the most important one, that is the Arctic and the Russian second strike capability based on submarines that normally are in the Barents Sea or in the Arctic Sea. And they have their bases on the Kola Peninsula. And there the US is very dependent on, let's call it, cooperation with both Norway and the UK. So it would be an extremely big drawback for the US if they could not use Norwegian and British facilities of different kinds to keep track of the Russian nuclear submarines.
Yeah. Then you have the issue, maybe briefly, about SACEUR. We don't know how realistic this idea is, that there might want to be shifting towards the European SACEUR, but you have mentioned it yourself here, and maybe you want to say one word about it before we proceed to Michael.
SACEUR is, let's call it, a heritage from the Second World War, when the US had all the military resources and the Europeans had nothing. During the Cold War, the Europeans, of course, developed their military capabilities, but still the US was the big brother, also apart from being a big country, also when it comes to military capabilities. So it was natural that an American would be SACEUR. But if the US withdraws from Europe with most of its conventional resources, then why should they be the ones that are in charge also of European forces, European capabilities? That would make it quite natural that it would be a European. But who? The German, because Germany is the richest country in Europe and probably will have the largest military forces. A Frenchman, perhaps, because French are quite used to having a leading role in Europe, and they have nuclear weapons. Or perhaps a British general or an admiral. that will not be easy to solve. And personally, I think that the only possible option is a Frenchman or a British, because neither Britain or France, I think, would ever let someone else, some foreigner, have control over their their nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
And Secure has to have that option.
Yeah. So if you agree, Karlis, I think we should move over to Michael. And there are a few other things that you mentioned, but I think you have already commented upon them earlier. So maybe we can enlarge Michael's presence now dramatically, put him in the center, because we haven't put forward any written material. You are now hopefully going to reflect and zoom out and put context on this discussion that we had so far, which for me has been very enlightening. Over to you, Michael.
Thank you. Thank you, Karlis. So thought-provoking. In my reflection, I would start by talking about the fact that there are so many things that have, I'm talking about Sweden now, but, to begin with, so many things that have hit us as big changes in a short time. And of course, our NATO membership finally came to being as a result of, or in reaction to the full-scale aggression against Ukraine by Russia, and then it rendered our non-alignment finally obsolete and meaningless, since the Russians had already proved, both in military action, but also in their ultimatum a few months before, that they did not recognize our right to choose our own path, so to speak. So that was natural. But then also, as we have seen, since our membership process coincided with links, as we have seen, between the East-West and the North-South dimensions of European politics. I'm referring here to, of course, our negotiations with Turkey. And Turkey is not an EU member, but it's an aspiring member or candidate member. But it's a full member of NATO, and as such had veto power against our entry. So that was a reminder also that when we finally became members, we also realized that it was not only a question of adapting quickly to NATO standards, but also adapting the role as a full member in taking responsibility, providing security for other member states, not just be expecting provisions of security by Article 5. So a completely new security policy context grew. And then, of course, we had the boom changes, and then finally with the policies of Donald Trump and his trends towards both agreeing on something with Putin's Russia, legitimizing Putin's Russia and Putin himself by taking these direct contacts, and then somehow legitimizing their own role rather than having a pariah stamp as before on him. But also the questions of what kind of agreement can they make between themselves, and then gradually including Ukraine in the process, and then also Europe at some stage. But it has put us in a very, very complicated situation as Sweden, but also as Europe. From what I heard of the discussions between you two so far, I appreciate fully that we are talking about a very, very difficult to define time gap. And the question of time gap has puzzled me all along a little bit, because I think we have been changing over time in assessments of the relationship between Russian and Western military capabilities. Now, of course, we are talking about the West minus the US. I don't think we'll ever come to that fully, but I will explain why I say this. But of course, the big question is, and I did raise, by the way, Karlis, the question of the Russian economy, how sustainable is it longer term. I was venturing to say in my last intervention that maybe even this year will somehow provide a measurement or a thermometer of the sustainability of the Russian economy. There are so many analysts that are questioning how long time can Russia maintain its war economy transition. We are talking, Lars-Erik, in our midterm report about the West-Russia relationship as a dual of deterrence, but also a dual of resilience in various ways between the two sides. And now the whole equation is being shattered recently by Trump's various steps and also indicators that the US is considering at least changing its overall relationship with Europe. And that's where we are now. I am in my thoughts on this. I have my sense that things are going need to happen to change the course of events over Ukraine this year. I mean, near term, for various reasons, and these changes need not be for good, of course. It could also be for bad, as we have talked about over and over again. But I do sense that, or in my feeling about this, is that the way investments over decades have been made by the US and by us in Western Europe, in the West Europe, to build the transatlantic links in various ways, to build reinforcement routes, to build all sort of things. I simply cannot imagine, even under Trump, that the outcome of this would have to make us have to seriously consider the US totally abandoning Europe and instead turning to other arenas like China and elsewhere. Not because of wish or thinking, but because of material necessity. There's so much investment made. And besides, I would add my comment also, but there is so much to say about all this, that there is a creeping ambivalence on the part of the US by its current representations in defense policy. When Rubio is saying to the NATO summit, NATO foreign minister summit the other day, that we really expect Europe to spend up to 5%. I don't think he is fully sincere about this, or at least I don't think that this is really thought through, because should that happen, then it would create an element of competition between the US and us in Western Europe. If we were to create something like European NATO or something, but without the US, it's not NATO any longer. So we could phrase it like that, but it's really not NATO. But I think that we should take into account the possibility that once, if time allows and Russian aggression allows, if Europe was to really create strategic autonomy the way the US pretends to wish us to do now, I think there would be a lot of second thoughts in the US, because they would not be so happy to have competition over the responsibility of overall global deterrence, especially against Russia, but also against China. I think that the US will realize at that stage that the fact of the discrepancy in terms of cost and burden sharing and everything is a reflection of US classical preferences concerning domination in the world and taking the full responsibility for the US global responsibilities, not just European security. I therefore think that we might end up at some stage in the scenario number 2. I think you, Karlis, also said that this would be your preferred outcome of the current chaos. And number 2 saying then that we will find perhaps some kind of agreement where the US maintains its extended nuclear deterrence, it would be reluctant to give up on it, given the deeper thought to this. But whereas the conventional defense would be rather autonomous on the part of Europe. And then there's only the sky is the limit when it comes to how much, not how fast, but how much the conventional capacities might be enhanced, and here to reach a point of perhaps sufficiency of deterrence, assuming that the U.S. extended nuclear deterrence remains, and then we have the question of the French and the UK nuclear arms, and that is, I think, more of a side issue. This is not to reduce at all the threat image that Karlis, have been depicting, but it's based on a belief of enlightened self-interest at some stage, which would point to some probability, if we can live through the next 3-4 years, of this scenario number 2 being what is the outcome once all players have decided what to do. But, and this is my final point here, but everything is now decided on the outcome this year of talks about Ukraine, because the current uncertainty, I think, is highly non-sustainable. So we'll see. It is a decisive factor, as pointed out in this paper as well. Okay, for now.
A lot. So, welcome into the center, Karlis, of attention in this. Maybe you have a few final words.
I don't have that much to add, really. I agree very much with what Michael said, and perhaps I should stress once again, my favorite scenario is the same scenario as Michael presents as the, let's call it, logical, enlightened solution. We have to cooperate, the US and Europe, in one way or another. We need each other.
Yeah.
It's, I would say, it would be preposterous, both on behalf of Europe and the US, to think that we can go it alone. It's bordering to the idiotic, really.
Yeah. Good.
Can I add on this on this point, Karlis, that and Lars-Erik, that I think also when I said that this year is likely to be somehow decisive because the current uncertainty is not sustainable, I also think that dramatic things will happen over Taiwan, and hence the global scene. I know that you and I have talked about, well, the three of us have talked about it many times before. I see a trend now. I should have said also that this tariff initiative now shows how far the Trump administration is willing to go along its lines before it gets a bloody nose from hitting a wall as a result of these policies. I do think that everything points to a dramatization in a few years' time. Everyone talks about 27 as the year when Xi Jinping has ordered the Chinese Popular Army to be ready to be able to conquer militarily Taiwan. That is one scenario, but there is so many other indicators showing that the Trump administration will find it very, very difficult to handle the dilemma of a one China policy, supporting Taiwan militarily, but not so much as to fully and totally antagonize China. So there is a clock ticking on that, which will have a huge impact on the overall global security scene. I guess, Carlos, that you agree with me on that also. I see you nodding.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm nodding.
Karlis has been on record also for telling us in the project that we need to focus more on China for quite some time, and we are struggling to find time to do that. Just to
Yeah.
finish off for those who have been able to stay with us so long, that we are going to do more podcasts covering the other parts of the project, including hybrid developments in Europe, civil defense, and defense industry, not least, and so forth. So hope you come back. You will find it on the homepage of the Academy, and we are going to use our new opportunities to select sources, to compile sources, to give you a real-time update on the most urgent issues to understand. The Presidium of the Academy has decided that we should not focus for the time being on major studies, major books, because they take time to appear, but rather do shorter things. And we will work in clusters in the Academy, trying to bring forward different voices on the topics ahead, using the advantage we have as a free and open academy, that we can discuss things, not least in what's happening in the West, which is difficult maybe to discuss openly in governments and in military structures. Maybe on that note, we can thank you very much for taking the time to do this, and we'll finish the podcast now.